Hi, everybody. Dr. Claire here. I've been watching some YouTube videos, listening to some podcasts, and I've noticed there's a trend to describe ADHD as some kind of superpower. It's interesting because as a person with ADHD, I'm not sure I think of it as a superpower, but I really respect the desire and maybe the resistance to thinking only about weaknesses and thinking about ADHD from the deficit perspective. As a psychologist, though, I do think it's important to really appreciate that ADHD, which stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is a mental illness. And to get a diagnosis of a mental illness as defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manuals of Mental Disorders, the impairment has to be present. So impairment could be in your social, emotional, or occupational functioning. But by definition, there has to be impairment. If there is not, then a diagnosis would not be made. So while I'm happy to talk about strengths, we cannot lose sight of the nature of ADHD as causing impairment in your life. Thinking about strengths is excellent, and it is a good way to feel positive about something that you're coping with. But I also think it could hide or devalue what you notice in your day-to-day life as very real barriers to living the life you want in a way that those around you, the neurotypical folks, seem to do more easily. I think it's worth, though, kind of reflecting on both. So as you might know, I have a course where I invite adults with a diagnosis of ADHD or suspected ADHD to learn some new habits, give up some old unhelpful habits as a way to feel more organized, goal-directed, and effective in their day-to-day behavior. And I'll show you my model just so you can be reminded if you haven't seen it before. So when we think about living better with ADHD, we're dealing with things like overwhelm, distractions, and procrastination by systematically looking at how we spend our time and implementing some fairly simple habits of scheduling, task lists, alerts, timers, that kind of thing. The people that I work with are telling me that they can meaningfully improve their day-to-day lives and feel more accomplished and feel like they are working to their own potential. And that is extremely rewarding for me, to help them go from feeling less than to feeling more normal and more in control of their ADHD. But I also think it's worth thinking about the strengths. So I have a new model that I wanted to share with you. Living better with ADHD redefined, let's say. So when we think about inattention and distractibility, we can think of it as a weakness, and it is in some ways, but we can also think of it as being response ready. And I quite like this way of thinking about it. People with ADHD constantly monitor their environment. So yes, we are distractible, but we are also ready to respond at a moment's notice if something important is happening and we need to address it. We are very motivated by the hunt. And so once we have a goal in mind, we will move forward. And we are response ready. Are we impulsive? Maybe. I'm impulsive. I tend to blurt things out, and sometimes I leap before I look. Okay. But I'm also willing and able to take some calculated risks, like starting a course as a psychologist entrepreneur, for example. Maybe you are an independent thinker. You might not be able to articulate your idea clearly and fully to those around you, but you know where it's going, and you're able to take some steps to get there. Maybe you are impulsive in your decision-making, or maybe you are simply decisive. I prefer to think of myself as decisive. I also think it's important to recognize that those loose associations that happen in a disorganized ADHD brain can also be a fertile ground for creative ideas and connecting things that other people might not connect. I myself am quite good at seeing patterns, and I'm not sure that would be as easy for me if I didn't have all those loose connections in my head. So I see that as a strength. Am I a poor planner? Maybe. But I'm also very results oriented. You might also be very flexible. So we can think of it as poor planning, or we can think of it as an ability to very quickly shift what you're doing if what you're doing is not working. If your day is going sideways, you might be able to recover it because you're flexible. Like most people with ADHD, you might have the hyperfocus quality so that you can really sustain your focus and dive deep at some points, though those times might be less predictable than you would like. There are ways to increase your ability to use your hyperfocus to your advantage, and so it can be seen as a strength. This isn't the answer to the deficit model of ADHD. ADHD is a disorder of the brain that is unwelcome in lots of cases. But it isn't only unwelcome. And the reality is, if you have been diagnosed with ADHD, you're coping with some problems. But I really respect the desire to push back against a negative label that puts you in a box that feels awful. And so I offer this as a way to think about ADHD in terms of strengths as well as weaknesses, so that you can own some of those qualities of yourself that do give you an advantage as long as you know how to harness it. I'll be very interested in your comments, so please comment below whether or not you think ADHD is a superpower or something to be managed. And if you notice my computer moving, it's because in my flexibility, I have allowed my cat to stand on the table here. So I'm gonna just let that be. Bye for now, folks.